How about take 5 on this video? I'm having a really rough time getting started. What I want to do today is start a series on what I call clutter saws. And this is a concept that Bob and I have kicked around a little bit. And the idea is taking stuff that's been sort of kicked to the side in the shop that's functional, possibly, but not something you'd want to put in the better of your own saws and certainly not somebody else's. But they're too good to really throw away. And the examples of clutter on this table are many, but for example, that piston was out of one of my early research saws, and that top wasn't quite square, so I had to trim that up to make it nice and symmetric. Another project saw, I had cut this base a little bit too far, so I wasn't going to use that one. Yeah, and this piston's got some, score marks and stuff like that. But they were, one of those things where I couldn't quite just pull the plug and put them in the trash. Probably should have. So they start getting scattered around the shop, and stuck in boxes, and next thing you know, you got this stuff stacking up. You get all that clutter. That's the raw material for a clutter saw. The second concept is the ultimate old man saw. I have to confess, as I'm getting older, the vibration and weight mean more and more. I'm not as interested in holding on to a steel MS660 as I am something with a nice, smooth anti-vibe system. The 372s were smooth enough and light enough for the longest period of time, and I eventually replaced those with this saw here, which was a 562 that's been modified. Now, the modifications on that saw were designed to take care of some heat issues and some starting issues, and comprised of increasing the compression and making some modifications to get heat out of the saw. And I did that on video, explain what they were about. For example, the muffler mod, cut covers, pop-up piston, deck cylinder. And while there may be more power in that configuration, the genesis of the design was other things. And I'm not going to go into the details. But anyway, what I wanted to do was to get that kind of power characteristics that I got out of that 562 modified and put them in a saw of that size and weight, the Husqvarna 555. And the differences between the 555 and the 562 are more involved than you might think. And that's kind of why I'm getting into this video. I want to consider this a foundation video of that whole discussion that intersects 3 subjects: clutter saw, the 60cc saws from Husqvarna, and what's going to be my ultimate old man saw build, which is those power characteristics on a smaller chassis. So anyway, lots to talk about, right? On the last couple of attempts, I've been having a hard time trying to break it down into subjects that are easy to explain, that are also easy to retain. This attempt, what I'm going to try to do is define classes of saw. Alright? The first and most obvious class of saw is brand, right? You got Husqvarna, the orange ones, and you have Jonsered, which are the red ones. The biggest difference between the two different brands are cosmetic. They really are. I mean, there's some other issues, but for the most part, it's cosmetic. For example, the whole Jonsered line has had that straight handle versus the angled handle in the Husqvarna. And along with that handle, you get things like a different top cover and a different chain brake. Different color, obviously, and there's other things, but I'm going to focus on that. But the mechanicals are virtually identical, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So class number 1 is the different brands, Husqvarna being orange, Jonsered being red. Class number 2 is more significant, and that's the actual chassis that the saw is built on. And I'm going to call the chassis cases, interchangeable. The 2 subclasses are large mount saws versus small mount saws. Now there's 5 saws total in that whole series of saws, right? You have the top of the line Husqvarna 562. The top of the line for Jonsered was the 2260. And then of course the Husqvarna version of the Jonsered 2260 was the 560, which was sold in Europe, not here in the States. And then the lower cost versions of that chassis, the first being the 2258 sold by Jonsered, that one right there. See, I've got 4 of the 5 saws sampled here on that bench in some form of construction or deconstruction. The lower cost Jonsered offering in that chassis was a 2258, and the lower cost Husqvarna offering on that chassis is a 555. Right? So of course, being a typical hot rodder type and, you know, hobbyist, you want to say, well, geez, well, how do I mix the best of each class and come up with something better than what Husqvarna already designed? And let me tell you what, that is not easy. So let me step back and let me just rattle off the 5 different saws, and we'll start going into the differences and find some other classes. So the 5 saws offered are the 562, 2260 by Jonsered, 560 by Husqvarna, 2258 by Jonsered, straight handle and all, and Husqvarna's 555. Now, the next part of the discussion spans both brands. Now, I'm going to be repeating the model numbers just to make sure that that gets, you know, well defined and well articulated. The next way of differentiating class of saws is going to be large mount versus small mount. All right. There's only one large mount iteration of that saw, and that's the Husqvarna 562. The other 4 are all small mount. And what that is the casting on the PTO side of the case is set up for large mount on a 562, and on the other 4, they're set up for small mount bars. All right. So you have the 2 brands, and then within the brands, you have the classifications of large mount and small mount. Now, the only large mount is the Husqvarna 562. I think I already said that. Jonsered did not get a large mount offering. So all the other 4 saws are small mount. All right. So we have the brands, and then we have large mount, small mount, and there's one other classification that differentiates the saws. And that is on the small saws, or the small mount saws. You have the higher end versions of the small mount that have stuffer cranks, and the 2 lower cost saws, the 2258 and 555, have got non-stuffer cranks. Now the stuffers are these things right here, right? And they're designed to take up case volume. So that's just sort of a broad overview of what we have. Brands, case designs, and then within the small mount case designs, crank configurations. Let's look at that a little closer, all right? Because now there is some overlap between the small mount and that unique large mount 562. And I've got to roll back a little bit to get into this next phase of the discussion. And that is that these things are very sophisticated saws. When they were designed, the designers had sort of a power characteristic in mind, you know. So they designed the saws as systems to accomplish those goals. The things that make the 3 higher end versions of that saw class more powerful are really a combination of parts. And again, the 3 being the 2260, 560, and 562. All 3 of those have a stuffer crank configuration. They have a different ignition, a different carburetor, and on the cylinders they have a little bit larger transfer caps than the lower cost versions that have a cylinder which is the same basic casting, but these caps are just a little bit smaller on the 2258 and the 555. So the system of parts that make the 562 and the 2260 and the 560 different than the lower cost 2258 and 555 includes, not exclusive to, stuffer cranks, different ignition, different carburetor, transfer caps. And what that system allows those 3 higher end saws to do is have something called rev boost. And it's a feature where for a very short period of time it lets the saw spin up to like 16,000 RPMs. And it's the combination of the ignition and the carburetor and all those other parts, stuffer crank, that lets that saw do that comfortably. Now the 2258 565 with the non-stuffer cranks have a different ignition system and different carburetor, do not have that rev boost feature. At this point I want to start talking about parts interchangeability, because we talked about brands, right? The different models and the brands, the higher cost, higher performance ones with the different crank, ignition, carb, transfer caps. But now to get into a little bit more granularity, there's a couple of subtle things you have to think about when you decide to start taking junk piles and trying to turn them into saws. Because the geometry of the large mount cases is different, all those things related to that geometry are going to be different. It makes sense, right? The most obvious is things like the clutch cover. It's going to be bigger because that section of the case is bigger. The other 4 small mount saws have a smaller cover. This is where it gets less obvious. The crankshaft. Even though both the 562 and the 2260 have stuffer cranks, the crankshaft for the 562 is unique because the stub right here is just a little bit longer to accommodate that larger case. So a 562 crank will only fit into the large mount 562 cases. There's actually 3 crankshafts in this series of saws. Like I just pointed out, the longer 562 stuffer crank, and I'm not aware of any non-stuffer cranks in the large mount cases, so it's unique. The second crank is the stuffer short crank that goes into the small mount cases on the 2260 and the 560, and last is the non-stuffer crank that goes into the 555 and 2258. The difference between those 2 short cranks, the stuffer and non-stuffer short cranks, is actually significant because the stuffers are held on by these little sheet metal rings right there. See that? So the stuffer version of that short crank is ever so slightly narrower, so when you squeeze the cases together, the bearings seat up against these little sheet metal rings. The non-stuffer crank is a little wider to take up that distance, so when you squeeze the cases together you get the same amount of support in the crank, right? So those are the major areas, you know. Other things that are different because of the large mount versus small mount include the oil pump components. The pump itself, I really don't know. It may interchange, but this rubber piece right here does not, because the distance from this surface here, the mounting surface, to the bearing is different on large mount versus small, so that's different. But also the distance from here to here, that groove, on large mount versus small mount, slightly different. So you cannot interchange this piece. The worm gears are different. That's from the small mount cases, and somewhere around here, this is for the 562 large mount. That's different. I'm not sure of the reasons, but there's also different clutch drums. And I've got different clutches, and I'm not sure if it's because of the different models or different model years. But I've seen things there that have been different as well. What else? Some esoteric stuff. Filters. Kind of backing out of the mechanical, going back into the plastic and cosmetics. The 562 has a taller cover and has a larger air filter than, say, the 555 and the 2258. Just a lot of stuff, you know. Just lots and lots of stuff is different. You just can't get a pile of parts of that class of saw and jumble them together like you could, say, with a 365, 372 series or the 350 through 346 series, you know. Just a lot of differences. Hopefully this will be of use to somebody. So I'm going to consider this a foundation video, sort of kick off the video series for the ultimate old man saw, and blend that with the concept of a clutter saw, and then try to take what I consider the best characteristics of that class and stuff it into the smallest set of cases possible so I get a lower weight. Now I understand fully that the best way of accomplishing that would have been just to get a 2260 from Jonsered from the get-go and then modify it the way I do on these saws, you know, where I drop that cylinder and do a pop-up, modify the muffler to get the air out of there, you know, cut the cover and stuff like that. But if I had done that, I wouldn't have the opportunity about talking about all these differences and jumbling up all this clutter. It's kind of like cracking eggs, where I'm going to bust this case apart, get that crank, and take that crank and stuff it in these new 555 cases. Scrambling eggs, you know. So I guess I'm going to wrap this one up, and maybe I'll post it today. And then the next video will be cracking eggs, because I'm going to start busting these cases down, trying to put together enough parts to build a complete saw on that set of cases. So if you're interested, stay tuned. Yeah, there's a bunch of little details that I didn't get to, and as I go through the series, I'm sure I'm going to flush them out, you know. But, you know, I'll go through a little bit about the differences between the EL 44, 46, 47, which is on this one, 48, which is on the high performance versions. We'll touch on that. There have been other updates. You know, they've changed the piston. But that's other that's not related to the models. That's just design updates. You know, they do share bearings. Flywheels will interchange. You know, handles, you can interchange handles. Tank handles, that is. But you know, you can't cross these with Jonsered and vice versa. I'm thinking I could probably put a orange one half and red other half cross brands and come up with a bob saw. I guess the real things to keep in mind though is the unique large mount 562 and all things related versus the other four models in small mount, and then understanding the differences between the higher performance ones that have the rev boost, stuffer crank, cap, ignition, carburetor, and making sure that you don't intermix those. You need to keep those pretty much consistent from build to build, which is, I guess, the bottom line.